Alright, I meant to say this on the last video, but I kind of get carried away sometimes. Alright, anyhow, one of the things, these 5 lines we really need to talk about in a little bit more detail. So, 23.5 degrees north of the equator is the Tropic of Cancer. 66.5 degrees north of the equator is the Arctic Circle, which is also, if you consider the North, if you looked at it from the North Pole, the Arctic Circle begins, a very familiar 23.5 degrees below the North Pole. Of course, the measurements are always with respect to the equator, so, 23.5 degrees north of the equator, Tropic of Cancer, and then 66.5 degrees north of the equator is the Arctic Circle, and the opposite is true. The Tropic of Capricorn, 23.5 degrees south of the equator, and then 66.5 degrees south of the equator would be the Antarctic Circle. And we'll talk about what someone would observe. And I indicated this in the previous video about the Tropic of Cancer. So on the first day of summer in the northern hemisphere, you would see the sun directly overhead, and that only happens once a year. Okay, for the equator, if you're right on the equator, so a person standing right on the equator, the sun would be directly overhead. That is 90 degrees with respect to the horizon, the local horizon. They would look, on 2 days a year. Because the sun is in the apparent motion of the sun in the sky is going, through these extremes, right, from the Tropic of Cancer across the equator to the Tropic of Capricorn, and then back again and back. That's what, when it returns one more time, that's 1 year. All right. So anyhow, someone on the equator would look straight up. On roughly March 21st, the sun would be directly overhead. That's the equinox, and then 6 months later, they would look up ahead, up again, and that's September 21st, and that would be the fall equinox, also known as the autumnal equinox. The sun would also be directly overhead. Okay, and then the last one I want to talk about here, with respect to the tropics, is the Tropic of Capricorn, and so that would be the first day of winter in the northern hemisphere, but for the southern hemisphere, that's the first day of summer. And someone standing on that line anywhere, like across Africa, for example, or South America, somebody would see the sun directly overhead, and of course that day is December 21st. Right, so the sun would be directly overhead, and that only happens once a year. Okay, so points north of the Tropic of Cancer, the sun would never be directly overhead. Points south of the Tropic of Capricorn, the sun would never be directly overhead. It would be pretty high in the sky, if you were just south of the Tropic of Capricorn. It would get pretty high in the sky on December 21st, and points just south of just north of the Tropic of Cancer would the sun would get pretty high in the sky as well. Okay, here in South Carolina, the sun gets very high in the sky. Now let's talk about the Arctic Circle and the Antarctic Circle. On the first day of summer, if you happen to be right on this line, 66.5 degrees north of the equator, which is of course the Antarctic Circle, on the first day of summer, the sun is going to be really high in the sky. I mean, you can calculate how high in the sky it's going to be, in fact, on that day, right at that point. The day when the sun, for somebody standing on the Tropic of Cancer, the sun is directly overhead. For people on the Arctic Circle, they would have at least one day where the sun basically never goes down, never dips below the horizon. Okay, so that would be, so you'd have at least one day right on that line, and then points north of that, right? You would have perhaps many more days, depending on how close you are to the North Pole. All right, and and then we'll go to the other extreme. Let's say the sun, the first day of winter, for the northern hemisphere, where the sun is directly over the Tropic of Capricorn. If you were still on if somebody was still on the Arctic Circle, you would have, on that day, right, which is roughly December 21st, right at that point, you would have complete darkness. The sun would never rise over the horizon. And for points north, you would have many more days. Depending on how far north you are, you would have many more days, perhaps even weeks, to months, depending on how close you were to the North Pole. If you were just there, living, which not a lot of people are, you would have a lot of time where it was you would be in complete darkness, and points just north of the Arctic Circle, that you would, like I said, that there would be at least one day, perhaps 2-3 days, but then the days where the sun was rising, it would just barely come up over the horizon, and then sink back down, and so you'd have really long nights, for the winter there. And of course, the opposite is true for the Antarctic Circle. That this would, on this particular day when the sun was directly overhead in the Tropic of Capricorn, points south. Well, let's go right at the Antarctic Circle. It would be, you would have one complete day of sunlight. There would be at least one day of complete sunlight. The sun never setting, and then if you were at points further south, you'd have many more days. Just saying, so they correspond, and it's very symmetric. Okay, I hope that clarifies things.